Hello, I'm Rain and welcome to my channel where I discuss fantasy Formula 1. The Monaco Grand Prix concluded yesterday, and it concluded with me crying for the second time this season after a Formula 1 race. So I just want to say a big thank you to Max Verstappen for dominating for the past 2 years so that I could feel these emotions now that I did not know I had for the sport. All jokes aside, a fantastic drive from Charles. He 100% deserves it. It's so nice to see him and Lando break those curses and finally win. But we're not here to talk about the drive. We know Monaco was a stinker. It was the first lap and the last lap, and then everything in between did not matter. We're not here to discuss that. We're here to discuss how the Monaco Grand Prix reflects in fantasy points, because that's all we care about here on this channel. Before we get into that, though, I just want to give a shout out to all of you that were there for my deadline stream this Saturday. Before the deadline, we stressed about our fantasy teams together. It was a great time. I'm going to be doing one again 2 hours before deadline at the Canadian Grand Prix. So that is, June 8th, right? June 8th at about 8 p.m. Central Eastern Standard Time. I will be doing another deadline stream, so join me then if you have questions, last-minute questions about your teams. We will be discussing free practice and all of that good stuff, and then watching quality together. It's been really, really fun for these past 2 weekends to do that, so I'm going to continue doing it for as many weekends as I can, and I think I'm going to be able to do it for Canada. So, announcing it now, another deadline stream coming for the Canadian Grand Prix, so subscribe so that you don't miss it, and let's get into the actual video. So this was my team then for the Monaco Grand Prix. And the transfer I made was only one transfer. It was Lando Norris out, Charles Leclerc in, saving one transfer for Canada so that I would have 3 transfers there. And what a transfer that was, I mean, it couldn't really have gone any better, could it? Charles Leclerc won, he got pole position, 45 clean points, DRS boost on him, done and dusted. Not so simple though. I had a lot of options about what to do. I was debating whether to use my second transfer to get Bottas out for Magnussen. Very, very happy I didn't do that. I was close to doing so, but I felt like all C-tier assets in Monaco would just be decreasing in price, and I was pretty close to that assessment and that guess. And Bottas's car seemed fine, and then, well, the Haas disaster that we're gonna talk about later happened. So that was a bullet dodged, but I was not really that close to making that transfer. The other transfer that I was close to making was taking a -10 to get Yuki and Lance Stroll out for Piastri and Sargent in. And that would have been a net positive overall. I did some calculations and I felt like worst case scenario, what would happen, this and that. And I think my calculations based on the average and the race simulations from F1 Fantasy Tools, which is a fantastic website that all of you should be using, the post FP3 race simulations calculated the difference between my team and the -10 hit that I could have taken for Piastri and Sargent in over Tsunoda and Lance Stroll would have been about 5 points and about 0.3 in price. So that was what I was working with. The calculations, or the simulations rather, said that I would be gaining, even with the -10, I would be gaining a few points and a few points into my budget as well. But I ended up not going with it. I felt like the gain was not big enough for me to risk it. I did not trust Logan Sargent in the race, and he did not have a great race. But obviously Piastri got second, which was not what I was expecting. I was expecting either Norris or Sainz to take the P2, or Verstappen, let's not forget about him. So I was kind of hoping Piastri would have been like a P5. Him being P2 was definitely worse for me. Overall, after making some calculations, I lost out on 9 points and 0.5 million by not taking the -10. So overall, it's not a massive loss. It looks like a big point swing, but you got to remember I would have had to take a -10 to get that team in. So overall, I'm not too upset not doing it. Now going into Canada, I have 3 transfers, and I also have some of the assets that I want moving forward. My total points then ended up being 199 points, which is decent. I'll take that. And that brings my overall rank to about 8,000. I'm into the top 10k for the first time this season. About a 5k green arrow, so a small green arrow, you know, but relatively it's actually pretty good, and I'll definitely take it. Me just having one of the Haas's definitely helps. I know people who had 2, and I feel for you. I'm sorry. Red Bull owners got completely shafted, right? So running Ferrari and McLaren was for sure the correct decision. Overall, I'll take it. I had some of the better, cheaper options in Yuki, Bottas. So with that said, let's move on and talk about what else happened in Monaco. And I've seen a lot of people talk about Mercedes assets being good. They increased in price by 1 million after all. Valtteri Bottas, I've seen that Red Bull are useless now. And a bunch of other things. Don't stress. Monaco is very, very, very much an outlier in every sense of the word, right? This is not a usual race, and the things that happen in Monaco are not going to happen going forward. So first of all, a big reason to what happened in Monaco and why it happened was that the average score in Monaco was 4.5 points. In large parts due to the 4 DNFs we had with Ocon, Checo, and both the Haas's, as well as the double Haas disqualification for a rear wing breach in qualifying. So both the Haas's had absolute howlers, minus 15 in qualifying for the disqualification, and minus 20 in the race for the DNF. So both Hulk and Magnussen with massive negative scores. Checo also minus 20, Ocon minus 19. All of these points accumulated to a very, very low average score. And when looking at price changes, if you haven't watched my price change algorithm video, I will leave a link in the description to that video so you can know what I'm talking about. But how the price change algorithm works is that it's based off of the average score, which means that all of these plus 1 millions that we saw from Hamilton, from Russell, from Bottas, even things like Tsunoda and Albon, getting those 0.5 increases are only because of how low the average was. Bottas only got 8 points. That will never be enough for a C-tier asset to rise 1 million in any other race unless there's like 10 DNFs, okay? Like that does not happen. That just does not happen. So because of the very, very low average, and you can see how low it was compared to the previous lowest, which was Saudi and Australia, it's less than half, right? It's less than half. So that really skewed it so that you did not need a lot of points to increase a lot in price. I think the Mercedes boys showed this quite clearly. Both Hamilton and Russell increased 1 million, and Russell only got 16 points. And to get a 1 million increase from a B-tier asset, they need to beat the average times 3. So in any other race, you can see the average is sort of hovering around. Ignore China and the US because they're sprints. But look at the other races. The average is hovering somewhere between the 9 and 12 range. That means for a B-tier asset to rise 1 million, you need to get above 30 points. And apart from Charles Leclerc, and apart from Charles Leclerc and like when Norris was a B-tier asset and won, right? And not even when he won, but when he performed well and got the driver of the day in China and Italy. And then Sainz when he performed well. Apart from those instances, these B-tier assets aren't reaching that 30-point mark that often, and it's usually only 1 or 2 of them. So the fact that Russell, with only 16 points, that's half of what he usually would need to get a 1 million increase, managed to increase by 1 million. It's not going to happen again unless there's like 10 DNFs. That's all I'm saying. So don't look at the Mercedes assets with big, big heart and starry eyes. It's not going to go well for you in the future, I promise. So those are the B-tier assets. Let's look at the C-tier assets then. So Bottas, again, 8 points to rise 1 million. To rise 1 million... as a C-tier asset, you need more than 1.5 the average score. So in a usual single race weekend, you need about 15-16 points as a C-tier asset to rise that much, right? To rise 1 million. And the only ones who've done that is Stroll in Australia, Tsunoda in Miami, and that was in a sprint weekend, and then now Bottas with that score of 8. So we can look at Stroll got 16 points in Australia, and that was one of the lower averages. So those 16 points would not have been enough in Bahrain, and would not have been enough in Japan either, or just have been enough in Japan. So even Stroll's best performance is just barely on the edge of giving him a 1 million increase. Tsunoda had that massive Miami score of 24, which is also very, very unheard of for those cheap assets. And then Bottas sneaks in with an 8-pointer for a 1 million increase. So the price increases are all out of whack because of the low average score. So you cannot look into the Monaco numbers too much for that specifically. Before we move on from Monaco to discuss strategies for Canada and beyond, we have to talk about Red Bull. What happened to them in Monaco? They didn't look to be anywhere really. They struggled all weekend, and Checo's car ended up being panini pressed into the barriers, but even Max Verstappen did not really look like he was going to challenge at all. They had multiple issues, and what do we do with our Red Bull assets? Are you sitting with Red Bull Racing now? Should you sell them? Are you sitting with Max Verstappen or Checo? Should you sell them? First of all, what is the problem? Well, from what Max Verstappen has said, Checo has said, Horner has said, and what we've seen them discuss sort of in different camera shots and the like, it appears that the RB20 is bad, or at least not bad, but hard to get right. It's on a knife's edge. We've known that. They talked about that last year, even with the RB19, that it is so razor sharp that you have to be perfect or else it doesn't work. And that's sort of what happened to Checo last year. The RB20 presumably has similar qualities, but or faults, I guess. But apparently there's something with these bumps in the tracks, right? On these uneven tracks, the RB20 does not perform as well, or at least it's very, very hard to simulate how it's going to perform, so it's hard to get it right setup-wise. At least that's how I've understood it. If I have something wrong or incorrect, please correct me in the comments. It seems to be something with these uneven street circuits that is giving Red Bull Racing problems. That brings us to Canada. Canada is a known bumpy track. Once we start getting to those proper racing tracks in Europe, I do think we'll see Red Bull come back even stronger. I'm talking Spain, I'm talking Austria, I'm talking Silverstone, I'm talking Hungary, I'm talking Spa, I'm talking Zandvoort, I'm talking Monza. I do think these 6 races in particular are going to be races where Red Bull come back and show how strong they actually are. Maybe they do get some 1-2s like we expected them to just sweep for the rest of the season. So I do think we should be on the lookout for that around Spain, and probably most definitely for Austria for the sprint race, should be the time where we get our Red Bull assets back into our team. We don't want to do our transfers in Canada, not have any Red Bull assets, and then we get to Spain with 2 transfers, and there's no way we can get Red Bull Racing in, and it looks like Max Verstappen and Checo are just gonna 1-2 it, right? That's the Red Bull Racing aspect of it, constructor-wise, and I guess Max Verstappen-wise, because Max Verstappen is usually flawless in that car. As for Checo, if you have him, I'm sorry, but if you have him, you should definitely sell for Canada. Because I think we need to evaluate him and make sure he doesn't go into one of those heavy dips that he did in the middle of last season over the summer period. So if I had Checo, I think he's a pretty easy sell to one of the Ferrari boys, just for Canada. And then you can reevaluate him come Spain, come Austria, because I don't think Checo is that bad of an option before he hits 25 million. We should wait and see on Checo. If you have him, I think you sell. If you don't have him, I don't think you even look at him until we know he is not going to enter one of those ruts like he did last year. Quick little outfit change. I actually recorded the first part of this video about a week ago, then I got caught up in some IRL stuff and had to put the video on hold. The advantage of being late on a video, though, is that we can talk about news that have popped up recently, and one of them is this one. Ocon leaving Alpine at the end of the season after, I don't think it was all due to what he did in Monaco. If you missed it, I don't know how you missed it. Ocon tried to make a move on Gasly, And the reports that came out after said that he had actually been told through team orders before the race started to just hold position and not make a move on Gasly. And what did he do? He tried to make a move on Gasly on lap 1, nearly took both cars out. I think he's lucky to only take himself out in that. After this, it's come out that he's leaving Alpine at the end of the season. What does this mean for us as fantasy managers? Well, not that much right now. There were some false reports that he was going to be benched for the Canadian Grand Prix. I'm pretty sure that was a mistranslation from a French interview, where it seemed like they were going to bench him for Canada. The actual words that were said were more on the line that there would be consequences. Perhaps these are the consequences. He's not racing with them next year. He's definitely racing for them in Canada, though. I don't see them benching him for that. That would be completely ludicrous. And he also received a 5-place grid penalty for the Canadian Grand Prix for that move. And I think that's very important for us. That is something we need to pay attention to, because if we look at, we go to F1 Fantasy Tools, the best website, and we go to overtakes, let's see, race overtakes, right? And then we look at the average top. You see Ocon right here. This is behind my camera. Ocon is the the driver with the 4th most overtake, averaging a 3.5 overtakes per race, just behind Stroll, Magnussen, and Hülkenberg. And this, I think, is very important because with a 5-place grid penalty, can we see the qualifying result? Quali position, there we go. Quali position for Ocon. He has improved literally every race. He's gone from 19th to 17th, 15, 15, 13, 13, 12, 11. So the car is on an upwards trajectory. The Alpine is not there yet, but it is getting better. And I think these results are very evident of that. And if you look at Gasly, it's almost the same story, right? P20, 18, 17, 17, 15, then at 12, then 15 and 10, right? So the Alpine is getting better and better and better. And Ocon, despite starting 11, 12, 13, 13, 15, 15, is averaging 3.5 overtakes a race. With a 5-place grid penalty, I don't think he's going to be in a P10, P11 is on the cards, of course, but you got to remember that this P11 was due to Alonso and Checo not getting out of Q1. So if we assume that Checo and Alonso actually perform where we expect them to perform, that would put Ocon at 13th, and with a 5-place grid penalty, that puts him 18th. And from 18th position, that would be his 2nd worst qualifying of the year. And on his average overtaking per race, he's looking like a really, really good option for Canada. So something like just getting Ocon in right now, he's at 9.2 million. I think he's one of the better C-tier assets, especially for Canada. Going forward, we need to assess him further, but considering his grid penalty, I think he's pretty much a no-brainer if you can afford him. If you have 3 transfers, if you have 2 transfers, if you don't need to change anything else on your team, I think you should look to get Esteban Ocon in for anything, right? I can even do personally. I can sell Bottas and do this if I want to stick with the 1 B-tier driver lineup. We're going to discuss that a bit later, but something like this looks very, very strong. Having the best C-tier asset, I still think Yuki Tsunoda is almost a must-have with how well he's performing, getting those P6s, P7s. Nico Hülkenberg and Lance Stroll, I mean, you saw that in the overtaking stats, right? Race overtakes, you saw that Stroll, Magnussen, Hülkenberg. So in a race like Canada, you know, there are overtakes available, and starting from further back, Hülkenberg might not be guaranteed to get a lot of overtakes if he starts in like a P10, and then he might decrease in price anyway. But having someone like an Ocon who's getting a lot of overtakes, and then having him start as far back as he will with that grid penalty, I think is a very, very strong option, and should definitely be considered for the Canadian. On the agenda, because this video is late, but the next thing we need to discuss is McLaren. Not specifically McLaren, but more so the transition of an asset from B tier to A tier. And if you had no idea what that meant, you need to go and watch my video on how team value and price increases work in F1 Fantasy. But McLaren is in the next in line of assets rising from a B to an A tier asset, and they will not be the last. All of these assets are going from a B tier to an A tier, and we need to discuss what that means. When an asset is at an A tier, they don't have the advantage of gaining a lot of budget. McLaren, Ferrari increasing 1 million in a race, that will not happen. The most they will increase in a race is 0.2 million going forward, right? Once they hit that A tier mark. So because of them not having the budget sort of advantage over assets such as Red Bull and Max Verstappen, who are already A tier, you need to evaluate the asset differently. And what I mean by that is that when you spend that much money and you're not getting extra budget gains from it, is there another A tier asset that is better? And if we compare just straight up McLaren the constructor now that it's 25.5 million and Red Bull Racing the constructor when it's 28.8 million, I think the Red Bull constructor is better. I've discussed this in previous videos how I think that the Red Bull Racing constructor is so good because of, you get Max Verstappen points, Checo if he performs well, and even if Checo stuffs it up in qualifying, at least he can get overtake points when he's not in Monaco. And then the main thing, if you compare constructors, is that the Red Bull Racing always get fastest pit stop points because their pit stops are just so good, right? I just think Red Bull Racing is just better than McLaren now. Before, I valued McLaren higher because you had those potential 1 million gains. You don't have that anymore. The Red Bull Racing and the McLaren constructor will rise at the same rate. So you won't be gaining money towards getting Red Bull with McLaren anymore. You're just stuck with McLaren versus Red Bull. And in that instance, I think the Red Bull constructor is just straight up stronger. Yes, there is a price difference, but I think that price difference is worth it. And I think having Red Bull over McLaren compared to having, I don't know, like a Yuki Tsunoda or a Magnussen over something like a Bottas, because that's sort of a similar price difference, right? You have Yuki Tsunoda at 9.8 and Bottas at 7.5. So not really, but it's close. So I think the point of this is that once these assets that we have been relying so much on, the Charles Leclerc, the Ferrari, the McLaren, Oscar Piastri, Carlos Sainz, maybe even Checo when he was performing well, all of these assets need to be reevaluated when they reach 25 million. And personally, they are sells for me. Either downgrading to a B tier asset to keep gaining budget, such as a Mercedes, or if we're talking a driver, say Charles Leclerc were to increase 1 million in Canada and another 1 million in Spain, then no matter what Sainz does, there's no way he's rising more, right? So switching a Leclerc to a Sainz for 2 races might not get you as many points, but that just a simple downgrade will gain you so much value that later on you can just get Charles Leclerc and something better back, right? So I think you have 2 options, and I don't think one of them is keeping. Obviously, that depends a bit. If McLaren is looking way, way better than a Red Bull, then, I mean, yes, obviously you get McLaren over Red Bull. But right now, I still think Red Bull is a better option than McLaren. And similarly to all the drivers, I think Verstappen is a better option than Leclerc. I think Norris is a better option than Leclerc. I think Sainz will be a better option than Leclerc. But right now, Leclerc is the best because he's below 25 million. So that is the important bit of information. Those price increases matter so much because later on, your team will be so much better. So I think for all of you sitting with McLaren, it's not an immediate sell. You definitely wait, see how it looks in Canada. If McLaren is looking super dominant, but then, yeah, McLaren would be better than Red Bull. But I don't hate the McLaren to Red Bull switch, and I also don't hate the McLaren to Mercedes switch. I'm assuming pretty much everyone. We can switch back over now. I'm assuming pretty much everyone is sitting with Ferrari. Right? Ferrari is obviously the best constructor asset right now. I don't think it's even close. But all of these constructor assets need to be considered, right? I don't think Aston Martin is an option at 15.2, but you could even do something crazy as going for an RB, right? I don't think that's the best way. I think Mercedes is better, but I think you need to evaluate McLaren this week. If it's a keep, the only way that McLaren is a keep this week, personally for me, is that if they look super dominant in practice and look to take a 1-2 in Canada. Otherwise, I'm probably selling to either Red Bull or Mercedes. And that's just it. Now, the final discussion before we get into my team and my personal plans are an overall sort of strategy discussion. Because right now, emerging, I feel like there are two main strategy differences that need to be considered. So we have these B-tier drivers that are really, really strong, and people are reaching budget levels where you can afford two of them, such as the Leclerc and Piastri. I had an option of going for this last week. I didn't do it. It was a slight mistake, not a massive one. But now I can't afford it with McLaren, but I could afford something, like this, right? We can even upgrade one more here. Something like this. All right, I would have to downgrade to Mercedes. This would be 3 transfers. It's an option I could go for, but what these different strategies are, I think always the best strategy, unless you're going for some crazy budget building shenanigans and RB look to be really, really strong, I think the best strategy is always to have 2 premium constructors, whether that's Ferrari McLaren, Ferrari Red Bull, or Ferrari Mercedes. That's up to you. But I think Ferrari is pretty essential until they hit 25 million. And then your option is to go for 2 B-tier drivers, such as Leclerc Piastri, Leclerc Sainz, Leclerc Checo Piastri, you get the deal. Or you go for 1 B-tier asset and the best C-tiers, right? So this is sort of what I'm at right now. You can afford something like this, right? And even have money over so you can have a better constructor. There you go. I think these are the main 2 strategies right now. The BCCCC asset and the option, and the BBCCC, right? So the double B or single B, and that's what I'm going to call it from now because I can't be bothered naming all the C's. So either the single B or the double B strategy. And which one of these is the better one, right? With this strategy, you have arguably the best budget, the best C-tier options in terms of drivers. Or you have slightly worse C-tier drivers, but you have 2 really good B-tier drivers. Which one is the best? And I think the answer is not as clear as you might expect, because I think most people would just say, oh, it's obviously the BB. But one thing I want to show you is so the main argument for the double B are the price changes that the C tiers provide. So if we look at how many C tier assets rise in price every race, there are 11 C tier assets in total. We're talking drivers now strictly. 11 C tier drivers, right? And so far, on average this season, 5 of these 11 have risen in price every race, meaning they got a positive score, right? And the main allure of a C-tier asset is that they can increase quite a lot in price. So far, 5 out of the 11 increase every race on average. Now, for sprints, that was higher. So if we exclude the sprints, that number drops to 4.3 on average. So on average, 4 drivers out of the 11 C-tier assets rise in price. The rest will decrease. Compare that to a B-tier driver. The only B-tier driver to not rise in price without crashing is Alonso. Alonso is the only B-tier driver to have decrease in price without crashing so far this season. And you can look at the stats yourself. Other than that, all B-tier drivers are increasing every week. Now, some weeks they're only increasing 0.1, right? But most of the time, actually on average, if you count in all the times they're increased with 1 million, the average is about 0.3. And if you then look at the C-tier assets, right? These C-tier assets are increasing 0.5 million if they increase. The average increase of a C-tier driver, if you look at how many of them increase in price, and there's only been a few outliers where they've increased more than 0.5. We're talking Tsunoda in the US, and then we're talking about Bottas in Monaco, right? Only a few times they've increased more than 0.5. So 0.5 is the most common. But when you look at all of the C-tier assets as a bunch, and only 4 of them are going to increase in price, if you take them 4.3 divided by 11 times 0.5, which is the increase that is expected, the expected increase of a average C-tier asset is only 0.2. So comparing that to a B-tier driver, that's then 0.3. I know the maths aren't exact here, but I'm trying to paint you a picture. It is very hard to predict which C-tier drivers are going to perform well. If you have the 4 best C-tier assets and the 4 assets that do increase in price, I think the single B lineup is much better. But it is difficult to predict, and especially since there's only a few of them that are going to increase in price. Now, again, the math is not entirely correct. I've done some rounding off here and there. These stats also don't mention points, but we already know that the B tier drivers are bringing in the more points. So it's looking like the BB is bringing in both more points and more price increases compared to a B with 4 C drivers lineup. Now, as I just said, the C tier assets are very, very hard to predict who is going to perform better than the other. And if I were to ask you which is the best C tier asset right now, I think most of you would say, well, Tsunoda, obviously. But if you look at Tsunoda, he's also only increased in 4 out of the 8 races so far this season. He's only increased in half of them. In the other half, he has not. Now, I know he has some DNFs in there, but he's not been the best performing C tier asset. In fact, he is matched by Ocon, Hulk, and Albon for price increases, apart from, the 1 million here, but the amount of times they've increased in price. He's beaten by both Stroll and Magnussen. Right? Both Stroll and Magnussen have increased more in price than Yuki Tsunoda. So I think it's very, very difficult to predict the C-tier assets, and I think that's what's speaking in the favor of the BB. But then again, if you get the right C-tier assets, and you get them completely correct, I think that lineup is stronger. Are you with me? I know there's a lot of just chatter here, but I think that's what you need to take into account. I also don't think the difference is big enough to where it is worth taking a -10. It would have been slightly worth for me taking it last week, but that was only by a margin of 9 points, right? So if you can't get to a BB, I think most people are on a lineup such as this, and I think if you can't get to a BB lineup for free transfers, I don't think you go for it. I think you stick with the single B lineup and just go for the best C-tier answers and hope you get it correctly. So with that in mind, what are my plans? What am I going to do for the Canadian Grand Prix? And the answer is, again, and I'm sorry, I don't know. I have so many options I could go for. I could transition with 3 transfers to a BB lineup that I just discussed. The way I would do that would be to sell Stroll and Tsunoda and McLaren, unfortunately. The reason I have to sell McLaren is because, I can't afford it anymore after the increase in Piastri. So it would be a Mercedes, it would then be an Oscar Piastri, and then probably an Ocon. Could be a Magnussen as well, but those would be my picks. So for my 3 free transfers that I have, I could do something like this. I could also stick with the single B lineup and just sell Valtteri Bottas for what I showed earlier in the Ocon section for Ocon, or again Magnussen if I want. I could also, if I don't want, I've not even talked about McLaren in this situation. I could just sell McLaren for Red Bull, right? I could get Red Bull back in if Red Bull are looking really, really strong, and that could be my 1 transfer. I would burn a transfer there. There's so many options I could take this team in, and I think it all depends on free practice and what the predicted points on F1 Fantasy Tools say. Should I move to a double B lineup, or should I stick with the best C-tier assets, right? I actually really like this run of C-tier assets. I kind of prefer it just initially looking, maybe even selling Hulkenberg for Magnussen, considering Magnussen's overtakes, and running this. I actually kind of like this, doing these 2 as my 2 transfers. I like it because I think if any drivers in the C-tier category are rising in price, I think it is these 4. And I think that could help me catch up to some of the people that are ahead of me that currently run something like a Leclerc Piastri. Because I think most people running either Leclerc Piastri or Leclerc Sainz are stuck with drivers such as Logan Sargent, Zhou Guanyu, Bottas. And if they perform poorly, I can gain a lot of value mainly on those strategists. And I'm still kind of in a chasing sort of scenario. I know my team rank is looking better now. I'm up in the top 10,000, but the top managers, the top strategists can really pull away with budget and with points if their lineup turns out to be the best. And I think while they are sort of jumping the gun on the BB by running the bad C-tier assets, I think I can gain on those strategists by running something like this if this goes well, right? It's definitely more risky, but I kind of like it. As for McLaren, it completely depends. If Red Bull are looking dominant, I will be very tempted to go for them, but then I would not be able to afford Magnussen and Ocon. I can't even afford the Ocon variation with Red Bull here, unfortunately. So I would have to sell, Nico Hülkenberg and keep Bottas. And in that case, I don't feel like my advantage over other strategists is big enough, right? Because yes, I get there we go. Yes, I get Red Bull Racing in, but I'm still stuck with Bottas. I still have Hülkenberg, which many of the strategists that are running BB values, BB type teams are running. So in that case, I'm only really relying on Lance Stroll and Red Bull Racing to pull the weight for me. And I don't know if I want to do that, especially because Red Bull Racing is not going to increase in price. I'm never going to get to a team like they have unless Lance Stroll goes crazy. So I don't really like relying solely on Lance Stroll. So I think the Red Bull Racing variant for me is personally less likely. I rather prefer the keeping McLaren, getting better C-tier drivers in Kevin Magnussen and Esteban Ocon, or just selling selling McLaren for Mercedes and going all out budget building, and just hoping Mercedes has a decent race. So I think those are my options for Canada. But as always, I will post on Twitter. I will have a deadline live stream once again where we'll go through everything. We will discuss the sort of free practice 3 simulations, the free practice 3 race simulations on F1 Fantasy Tools, and make a decision then, compare the BB version of my team versus this one. If you are still here, thank you for listening to my rambling. I will probably have another video out by the end of the week, so subscribe if you don't want to miss that, like the video, and leave a comment about your team, your decisions. What decisions are you facing this weekend? Do you need any help? I'm usually pretty good at responding to comments within the first day or two of them appearing, so I will respond to as many comments as I can. And if you don't get a response, then just pop into the live stream and I go through most comments there. The chat was a bit crazy last time, but I will try and answer all of your F1 fantasy questions as always. That will be it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. See ya.